So Ed was 5 years off. I think I met him in probably the early 70s, 70 or 71. And I have been a practicing graphic designer for 45 years. And I thought I'd put together some things I've learned along the way. And it's a short talk, but it will sort of tell you why I think the way I think, why I design the way I think, and the way I do. And I think it is things that happen to you at the moment you walk into design that you retain forever. So here are some life lessons from the field. Fall in love with something that was designed. That means that in your early days, and it's probably happened to many of you, there were things that you saw that you retain forever, because when you see things for the first time, they're more meaningful because you don't know them. For me, it was 3 Beatles covers. It was the Revolver cover, is where I learned obsession, and it came to factor into my paintings a lot later. The Sgt. Pepper cover, where I learned about using cultural references in design. And the White Album, which was the ultimate chutzpah cover. And that I find when I think about what I'm going to do or how something can be, I'm always drawn to these 3 factors. They never go away. They've stayed with me for 45 years. It's great to have heroes and mentors, and I had 2 really big ones. The first was my teacher at Tyler, a man named Stanislaw Zagorski, who was a Polish illustrator who came to the United States. And I went to school at Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, and he had done the cream cover. How cool is that? Now, I didn't go to school to be a graphic designer. I really didn't know what graphic design was. I wanted to be an illustrator. Discovered soon I couldn't draw. But part of the reason I wasn't comfortable with design was I was very uncomfortable working with type. It seemed sort of like a form of organization. And to me, that was like cleaning up your room, and something I had no interest in, particularly as an individual. So Zagorski, realizing that I was screwing up everything I touched, said 3 simple words to me. He said, "Illustrate with type." And that, in fact, gave me my whole career. I've been doing it ever since. And I didn't even know it when he told me. I didn't know how valuable those words were. It's only in retrospect. And sometimes you'll go back and you'll search and you'll find that that happened to you. And of course, the other major mentor and influence in my life is my husband twice, Seymour Quast. And I met him with my portfolio in 1970 when I was graduating school, and I was 21 years old. And I was a fan of his work. And he taught me how to see, and he taught me how to work. And that I've used that forever, even though our work is quite different and we lead very different work lives. So much of what I learned through his eyes stays with me. This was very important to me personally as a working person. In the 70s, when I began designing record covers, I hated Helvetica. I just hated it. I thought it was organized, orderly, and boring. I also thought no matter who used it, it always looked the same, no matter how they used it. Sometimes the spacing was better or worse, but it was always the same, and that's not what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was to make things that were recognizable as individual things. And initially, I worked very much like Pushpin, except for I didn't make pictures. I used typography that I would draw or pull out of type books and redraw or find in antique stores and have somebody else draw it. And doing this kind of very difficult work pre-computer was great for me because it was a challenge and because it was something I became obsessed with. And this work I did in the 70s stayed with me really forever. And I think what was fascinating about it to me, looking at it now, there were things that seem obvious and easy, but at the time they weren't because people didn't design like that. Doing an illustration and putting typography on it wasn't that unusual, but doing the back cover without any illustration on it, in fact, was. So in a sense, when I had done this back cover in 1976, it was more radical than you would imagine at that time. And we built things, and this is pre-computer, so these things were made by hand. They were inlaid, and they were drawn. This is my own drawing and Nick Fasciano building it. Or the stained glass window that was also built by Nick Fasciano. It seems easy now. You just sort of, manipulate something in Photoshop, but in those days you actually had to make things. And there was something about that craft that stayed with me forever that I always missed. Or redrawing typography in the mechanical bullpen room and putting it together by hand, or piecing together type in a way that wasn't typically done. But this was all my rebellion to Helvetica on the grid, and all of that provoked that. This is a hard one. You find that you know different things at different points in time. When you're young, you don't know very much, and you're in 20s, so that everything that you learn is huge, and you have tremendous growth really quickly, and you sort of leap up this surreal staircase. In your 30s, you know a little bit more, so you don't grow as much. But if you notice, the risers get shorter, the steps get shorter, and the risers get shorter and the steps get longer as you get older in your 30s. And you're a pro. In your 40s, you're an aging pro. But your 50s are great because you actually achieve power. And that's because your clients are getting to be the same age you are, and people in their 50s are at the top of their game. So you're working with a person with the most power, and that's the best period for your work in terms of actually accomplishing things. But then in your 60s, they start dying or retiring, and you're in deep trouble. The diagram of power sort of works like this. In your 20s, you're either a peon or a wunderkind. If you're a peon, that's okay, you got a lot of room for growth. If you're a wunderkind, that's actually dangerous because you have nowhere to go but down. In your 30s, you're a pro. You're a young pro, that's good. In your 40s, you're an aging pro. By your 50s, you've hit the power stage. By your 60s, it's waning power. By your 70s, it's total decline. And in your 80s, it's life achievement awards and or death. There are variances in it, but not many. I've checked it out. So the next rule is really to go the distance and to keep working and to find the thing that you can work on and you can stay with and you can grow and that can sustain you. And for me, I was lucky in that it came in a form of a particular account, which was the Public Theater. And I began designing for them in 1994 when I did their identity. And I've been working for them for 23.5 years, still going strong. And I was capable of using this as a vehicle to grow because I stayed with it season after season, year after year. It had good seasons and bad seasons. It had times I thought I would drop it. There were very frustrating times, like when it became a hit in this capacity and people began imitating it, because I went through a period where the Public Theater essentially lost their identity because everybody else was doing it. But I began to grow it and try to bring other forms of language to it, change type with it, destroy it. Here I moved wood type to Accidents Grotesque and nobody even knew I changed the logo. And here, and then changed it again. Public Theater actually has 3 logos in its 23 years where the thing has been redrawn from really original Morgan wood type to Accidents Grotesque back to Knockout where it currently is. Then we began redoing the lobby and doing the environmental graphics and did installations and type into the walls and donor signage. And here's where my posters belong, behind glass, as something from the past. And I realized at the point that I had finished the lobby that the public, I had to really rethink about how they talk to the world, because all of communication had really changed. It wasn't just that things had become computerized or that there was digital media. It was the amount of different platforms that things had to exist. And for a theater that had this many components to exist, the language would have to be broader based and capable of hitting more people and being more connected. So what I did was take the Shakespeare in the Park posters that I was doing every summer and turning them into mini identities that changed every year. And that I would analyze what was in the poster, whether it was a color palette or the way it was working, and begin to do a whole season in it. And I began doing this every year, which I've been doing for 4 years. And it really has worked for the public, where I began to use this in other projects, where identities have subsets that continue to grow for specific periods of time and then change just as soon as you get sick of them. And it's been fascinating, and I would not have come to this if I hadn't stayed with this project for 23 years. It's interesting how when you go the distance with something, you find yourself changing with it. This was last year's. This is what you see around town now, and it'll go away this summer when the next one emerges. This is a really hard thing to be when you're in your 40s and your 50s, is to be a neophyte, because you just know too much. If you've done something over and over, you know it again and again. But I was lucky in that I began doing something that I didn't know how to do, which was environmental graphics. I discovered that I didn't understand enough about architecture to make intelligent contributions, so I would do things that were sort of naive and silly, but in them were breakthroughs. For example, this is a building in Newark, New Jersey that was a school for performing arts, and they wanted to do something inexpensive, and I thought, well, what if they just cover it with typography? And I did a Photoshop rendering, and the Photoshop rendering became the building. There it is. And that I wouldn't have done anything that silly if I had been actually doing this professionally before I had started. I just made a crazy assumption about it, and it led me to do some work that was extreme. So I began doing a lot of it, and of course, after you do anything 3 times, you become an expert, and then you don't know anything anymore. It's sort of boring and hackneyed. I began sort of doing change and creating movement for myself by changing materials and learning how to work in all kinds of medium, and experimenting with plastics and glass and all kinds of things, and digital medium and things I didn't know how to work with. But it all was the same vocabulary, really. It was taking typography and using it in crazy scale situations in space, and it became very much part of what I do. Then I began building strange objects out of them, or extruding things, or projecting things, or building murals in places out of paper. This is Planned Parenthood, which just opened 2 months ago, their headquarters made out of their identity. And doing sign systems for the city. This was the Rockaways after Hurricane Sandy. It became a sign system for all the beaches along the coast of New York City, and then painted buildings that were part of the system. From these heavily structured concrete buildings were all painted bright colors going with the system. And finally to a typeface called Rockaway Wide, which became part of their boardwalk, and it's a font made out of 90-foot planks, altogether making probably the biggest pixel in the history of typography. And this is the boardwalk at the Rockaways, which is right near Kennedy Airport, and you fly over it when you come into land. And that sort of shows you, we had a drone go up and film the whole thing. It was kind of amazing. This is very, very current. It's going to open April 7th. It's the Quad Cinema on 13th Street, and it's a theater built out of typography that has 4 movie theaters in it, and lighting on the ceiling that is typographic, and programmed digital screens in the back, etc. It's all really the same extension of the neophyte from not knowing exactly what I'm doing. It's been great. The other piece of advice is to find a personal expression, and you got them. You just have to determine what it is you want to do. I felt like all that work I did in the 70s was lost when the computer came in because I wasn't using my hands. So I began painting these out-of-scale maps. And I did it in a room in my country house in Salisbury, Connecticut. I didn't expect anything to happen with them. I was just filling time and using my hands and making stuff, which is the best part of designing. And by accident, I found a gallery and I started showing these things, and people seemed to like them and started purchasing them, and now it's part of my life. It's a thing I do all the time. And I don't want to stop designing to make paintings. I see it as an extension of the same thing. Hell, they're not that different. They're still type. You know, I didn't start doing landscapes. But I find that these give me a lot of pleasure, and this was from my last show about a year ago. And then it got married to environmental graphics, which was interesting. This was a commission from the city of New York, where we took a painting I made and I had it blown up and had a sign painter repaint it onto individual pieces of masonite that were screwed into this wall to make this mural. And I see his hand on top of my hand. If you look very closely, you can see the seams of the tiles. It had to be removable in case of fire because it's the city owns it. So it had all kinds of restrictions. That's me and the actual painting against the blow-up of the painting that was repainted. But here, this thing I did on my own then became part of actually a working job, and they become connected. They're not that disparate. This was done recently in Philadelphia. It was my alma mater, Tyler, invited me to have a show and to involve the students. And I had the students paint a map that was going to fill a 3,000 square foot space. And what I did is made a small painting of the map in these colors. And then we broke them up into tiles, and like the other thing I just showed you, and taped it to the wall. And the students each got a section of the area that they filled in by hand. So the whole thing was made by 152 students against my line work. And I had so much fun doing this. I really want to do a lot more of it because it was new and different, and I was amazed that it in fact worked, because you would think 152 people would just be doing something different, but they really didn't, because they were given one color of paint and 3 brushes of widths that they could work with, so they were fairly limited, and the designer was still controlling. This is a controversial piece of advice, but I found that to be able to continue to grow, if I hadn't worked for free, I wouldn't have made any breakthroughs, because I would get the jobs I was always getting, and I would repeat the work I'd always be doing. So in order to change, I took on different pro bono jobs. I did things like an AIGA cover, which was a donated piece of work like we all do, and I started painting because I didn't want to have any money used for expenses, because there was $1,000 for it. And if I painted the thing by hand, I got to keep the fee. That's how I started doing these small paintings. I kept doing them when people asked me to do free work, just simply because it was an easy thing to do. I made series of silkscreen posters when I wanted to switch my work and make it much simpler, and I made these for sale with a silkscreen printer, and it was a way of growing what I was making and doing at a time that I felt my work was getting stagnant. Posters were easy to do. I did them for all types of things, and it was a way of stretching, but I also donated things to the city, like the park across the street from where Pentagram is. 2 guys came over and asked for a free logo for a thing I never heard of called the High Line. A guy who had a restaurant across the street named Danny Myers stuck a shack there, and he asked me to make a logo for it. They paid me later, believe me. And then actual real donations, like a sign system to the city of New York, because they didn't have the money for it and they needed it. But these were things that I think people think they're not supposed to do, or somebody's taking advantage of you, or that you shouldn't use the opportunity to grow yourself, and it's a loss, because this is where you get to do some of your best work. It's really, really good to hang around with smart people. especially when you're feeling stupid. Sometimes it just rubs off on you. And I hang around with a lot of them. These are my partners at Pentagram, and in all ways they sort of inspire and provoke, and I think that without them I would not have been able to keep working at the level I've been able to. And find a group, hang with them, it's worth it. This is the hardest piece of advice I have. Do what you do best, but you got to change with the times, and that's rough, because sometimes what you do best is out of style. So it's a question of figuring out how you take what you do and adapt it to the moment that you're doing it. I was a lot of things at a lot of different times. In the 70s, I was really a conceptual art director because I made all these covers for CBS Records, the ones I showed you that had all this typography on them. But I also was art directing and buying photography and illustration, and sometimes the type was very neutral or no type at all, or sometimes they were famous recording artists or goofy bands, or things that I really loved and thought were powerful and things I absolutely hated. And that the thing was that at that time, which was the 70s, where I'm really in my 20s and on that low rung of the staircase, everything was new and everything was a learning experience. And from that period, that eclectic typography really made me a postmodernist in terms of the way people thought about my work. I didn't know it. I didn't understand what the term meant at that time. But I made things in the 80s that were really about using style, discovering history, and putting imagery and typography together in a way that drew from stylistic periods. And sometimes they were on self-promotion pieces, and sometimes they were on real jobs, and sometimes they got me in trouble. In the 90s, I really became what I would call a typographic expressionist, and that sort of went along with what was going on stylistically. If you think about the 90s as sort of periods of Brody and David Carson doing some extreme things, I was doing them in my own way. And of course, there were these pieces that everybody knew at the time. And they were loud and proud and complicated and aggressive, and I think right on for the decade, but they were me. And by 2000, after New York got hit by 9/11, we all became minimalists, and we all began to hold back and find a purer way to say something. And then the decade became a little richer, so we became a little bit more expressive. But pretty much when I look at my work from the 90s, it's all withholding, and yet it's still illustrating with type in every way. In this decade, I began to think in terms of visual languages. It's really what I was talking about with the public theater, where the logo is less important than the way pieces and alphabets fit together. And that I really used, again, a pro bono job to sort of figure out how to talk in style, like how much could you read of individual letter forms and recognize them as one thing. And I had, I think at the time I did this, 12 different designers at Pentagram, each did a TDC, and they were told to do it in red, make it concentric, but the line weights can be anything. And then there was a moment where they weren't recognizable as the same thing, and we began to create a parameter that became the manual for doing this. And that was really great because it enabled me to do a lot of things in the decade that were really similar, that were real situations, like this. Or that. But it's really, what do you recognize? And can you recognize something without a logo? And with alphabets, of course, you can. I think almost every job I work on now has some kind of component or part of this, just simply because it gets you into every form of digital media and you have no problem being seen or understood. It's for a group that is about stopping the period tax. And it's already been knocked off, and it's only been on the internet for 5 minutes. It's absolutely amazing. People rob languages now. They don't just rob logos. And then there was Parsons and the New School, which was programming 3 alphabets together to create a new font. And I think I designed this 2 years ago, and I see more and more people doing it, which is really strange because it was sort of scary when it launched, but not now. Here's the school doing it. And I love when you make these languages and they go out into the world and other people start stretching them and playing with them, and it's great. So that's all of my wisdom. And one more thing, you can see it now all together in one book compiled by Spin and Adrian Shaughnessy and published by Unit Editions, and it'll be for sale if you go to the internet at Unit, and it's 520 pages, and Tony Brooke did an incredible job of making me look good, and I hope you all see it, and thank you very much. I'm supposed to do Q&A. I'll take them. Come on, you have to ask questions. I'm standing here. You're not allowed to not ask them. Oh my God, what a dead audience. Yes, okay.
Hi, my name is Julia. Thank you very much for the presentation. And my question would be about the maps. What was the first map you drew and what it was representing?
The first map I drew was on the back of that AIGA cover in 1991, I think, or maybe 1989. And it was a joke. It was a cover I had done because the thing was called Graphic Design USA. That was the name of the annual. And the front cover was a listing of all the states in the United States and the percentage of people who used Helvetica. And the back cover was a painting of the United States I did from memory and accidentally left out Utah. And I looked at it and I thought this would be great. So I started messing around with them. First they were small illustrations, and then they gradually became bigger. One day I looked at them and I thought this would be much better big. And that's when I started really painting the serious maps. Yeah.
Thank you for talking to us today. I always look at your work and it seems very fearless to me. And I'm wondering if at those different points, when you're 20s and 30s and 40s, were there like multiple moments where you kind of had to find that confidence or that ability to kind of think outside of the box, or do you attribute that fearlessness to just something that's you've kind of always had?
I'd say it's probably a combination of both. I mean, I am acutely aware that you have to challenge yourself, and that if you find yourself in some sort of plateau where you're doing everything very much the same, you have to either redirect yourself or become even more obsessive about it. You have to do one or the other. Otherwise, it sort of gets flat. And for me, I really don't have a broad palette. I'm a horrible art director of photography. I have no interest. I always hated photo sessions. I don't like illustration because the illustrators get all the credit. And that for me, I have this limited, teeny palette of typography in which I do a couple of small things well. So the question is, how many things can I do them on, and how much can I change it to keep this game going? And that is, in fact, what I've planned and what I do. And I do it consciously, and I do it in specific periods when I notice things are getting flat. I can't pretend like these things just happen. But I've been lucky, I think, to seize certain opportunities to do them, and also to use the opportunity of pro bono to reinvent, because that's where you get to do it. Otherwise, you're just trapped in who you already are, and you don't get to expand it. Yes.
Well, I didn't. There, sorry.
I like when they stand up and yell.
Hello.
Hello.
So I wanted to talk about the low ratio of women creative directors. just sort of across the board. And I noticed, or you know that in your abstract episode, you talked about how you didn't, you like sort of succeeded in this, you know, as a designer, and sort of peripherally noticed other women sort of encountering problems like that, like maybe not moving ahead. Do you have advice for everyone in the design community to how we can sort of close that gap of, you know, of creating more female leaders in the design industry?
Well, I had a particular philosophy about it, which is that I thought originally I could help women because I thought it would be really good if people thought that women made really good designers. You know, I mean, it's sort of like the way they thought they made good nurses and school teachers, why couldn't they make really good designers? And that it could become a woman's field. Why not? I'm surprised it took so long, but I see more encouragement about it every day. I don't have any advice for how one encounters it because I don't know you as a human being. So I can't say, oh, do this. I don't know if that would work with your personality. But I think the thing to do is understand that it exists, that it didn't go away, and work anyway, because that's its best revenge. That's the best advice I can give. Sooner or later, it breaks down, and it's one by one. It's never going to be all at once, but just keep doing it. I mean, there are a lot more women practitioners than I remember when I started. There are a lot more women in higher positions than I remember when I started, even though it's not anywhere near half. And women also get to work longer, because they're smarter. One more? I can't see.
Here, we have one hand.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit more about defying the staircase that you outlined in your presentation? Because I'm a student right now, a senior. I'm very much trying to figure out what my career might be and, you know, get a first job and get paid for what I'm doing. So I guess any advice or any more clarification on how or what that could be?
Well, it's hard to tell you what to do because what I learned was in retrospect. So it's not like I can say do this and you'll be on that career staircase. I can only tell you what tends to happen. And I think that has to do with growth. But if you take my staircase literally, which is, it's not that crazy, you'll find that the next 5 or 10 years are periods where you learn the most because you know the least. If you don't know very much, every experience is new. So that's your opportunity to seize it. And what you want to do is be around people and experiences that can open your eyes and teach you how to see. That's why it's important to have mentors. That's why it's important to fall in love with design. All those things matter because that's how you grow. After that, call me up.
Thank you.
And I think that's it. Thanks.